for Cuba's case, UN over and time and again have voted, the majority of the countries voted to remove sanctions against Cuba, but America and Israel have consistently refused to honor that, even when the other 150-something countries have said so. So recapping from what we discussed last week was, we're looking at, can we have a legal framework that can address some of these discrepancies? If 151 or 52 countries can sit down and say, we remove sanctions, you remove sanctions, because actually they're not UN sanctions, these were American sanctions. They say, you remove these sanctions from Cuba, but America and Israel are saying, no, you can go ahead and vote and talk, but at the end of the day, no one is going to happen. How do we look at this situation? I will begin with Mr. Awich. How bad can this be?
Thank you so much. You made mention of Haiti and in relation to being an African country. I just like to slot in a point there, because we are on a Pan-African program. I said sometime in passing that the concept of Pan-African ideally means African as a continent and beyond.
Yes.
That is why it is called Pan. Now, Pan-Africanism, that feeling of Africanness, started incidentally outside Africa. Why? Because the blacks who found themselves in slavery, or at a later generation, the grandchildren of slavery who were educated, started feeling the injustice. And also some early Africans who went for education outside, caught up later. So they felt this Africanness outside. Now, they have had the urge of being home. In fact, it's illustrated in one of Lucky Dube's songs, saying the green is greener the other side. Lucky Dube was singing for Africans out in the diaspora that back home the grass is greener. Therefore, at some stage, many Pacific countries who had a lot of blacks, because they were taken there for sugarcane plantation, they had actually applied to join African Union, because they said they are Africans in diaspora, but they feel Africanness.
Exactly.
Therefore, Haiti, which is nearly 99% blacks, have that feeling. And therefore, the Africans, and with the due development of African Union, there are many countries in the Pacific, including this ones who run so well. What is it?
Jamaica.
Jamaicans.
Jamaicans, those were slave producers who were incidentally the slave drivers were the Indians, because the British had practiced their colonialism in India.
Yeah.
So whenever they went, they would bring Indians as supervisors of slaves.
Of the blacks.
So, Pan-African did not start in Africa. It started from outside. And therefore, countries like Haiti, like Jamaica, are actually intending to apply to be members of African Union. And that is when we shall have the real pan. Otherwise, now, if you talk of the 54 countries of African Union, it has nothing to do with a pan.
Pan-African, yes.
It is Africa per se without a pan. So I just like to mention something that you talk about Haiti in that respect. Now, you talk of effects. It's so wide. I'll talk briefly and my friend will say it. Now, first of all, if you talk of Western sanctions, especially sanctions from United States, first of all, it's done through multiplicity of laws. There are several laws, because the United States does not come and say we're giving sanction today. it must have the effect of law. So they pass a law. So you find so many laws which you could cite if you wanted them later. But there are so many sets of laws. Now, the practical effect is targeted at economic aspect, which means trade and otherwise. Now, we mentioned the other time the third party bit. Now, the effect is so grave that, for example, say Venezuela. Recently, you heard that the United States impounded a Venezuelan airplane.
Yeah.
And that plane incidentally had been used by the president. This is under one of their laws which says they prohibit trade. Now, this particular plane was bought by another person from America and sold it to Venezuela. So their laws empower them to impound it. So when they found it in Dominican Republic, where they had authority, they picked it. So that is how grave it is. But the other effect that I would like to illustrate is, for example, a Venezuelan plane can refuse to be refueled in a, say, a country or a oil company, like if, say, Shell, America has interest, they can refuse to fuel it, and it has happened. It has happened. The other bit is that the practical effect on the welfare of the country. You see, a country like Venezuela was getting $40 billion per year.
Yes, one of
for
the,
petrol,
it was
from
one of the
petroleum.
richest countries in South.
Now, because of the sanctions, they removed 39 billion 600 million. Imagine a reduction of your income from $40 billion to 400. That is like death. So unfortunately, some of these rich countries had also not built internal mechanism of food production. You see, the Ugandan situation is that even during Corona or even bad economic crisis like the war in Ukraine, Uganda is steady. Why? Because we have our food.
Even during war in Uganda itself.
We have our food. Some of these countries, especially the petrodollars, tended to rely on food from us. For example, Libya. During the Gaddafi days, Libyan tried to keep sheep and goat in the desert. They nearly were importing grass for their goats and sheep. So they found it cheaper to import meat than keeping. So you'd find at Tripoli airport, beef is landing fresh, still with blood, from Argentina, from Brazil, from Italy. Now the effect is that should that be cut, then you're in problems. So this is a similar thing in Venezuela. They had the money, so they could buy anything, $40 billion yearly. Now, if that is cut, it has a drastic effect, even on food.
Yeah, I saw the supermarkets, the rats are running all over the place.
Yes, so that is the effect. So it affects, a sanction will affect even the food, including milk for babies.
Sure. Including
milk for babies. Now, if you take, for example, the effect on Cuba, you know, Cuba had a very developed medical industry. The education itself, and even the working, including pharmaceuticals. And you know, we live in such a global world that no country can claim to make everything, including America. You either need cobalt from Congo or something. So likewise, even in pharmaceuticals, you find Cuba needs something, but sanction will block it. So we can see how it can even affect drastically the making of medicine itself, even if you have the capacity. During COVID, Cuba lacked oxygen, and Cuba was not even intending to get from United States. It was getting from a third party. You can imagine the legislation that was passed in US then, or which is still a law up to now, even prohibited the third party, the third country giving oxygen to Cuba during the crisis.
Sure.
So we could go on to mention the sanctions. It is very terrible. But my last comment is, you were saying, can we do something? Well, something can be done, but I just want to mention the challenge. For example, the laws that was passed that listed Cuba under the list of terrorists,
yes,
countries supporting terrorism. It's so drafted and passed in a way that European Union always want to protect their companies doing business also, because they also have their system of protecting European Union companies. But you can't imagine that the law is drafted in such a way that even European Union companies cannot do their business, even if they have European Union interest. So the law is drafted in such a way that even a European Union company wanting to do business, say for example with Cuba, wouldn't. So, but there, of course, the other time we talked of a range of things that can be done. Maybe we shall discuss it later. But I just wanted to mention here the effects and the challenge in what we can do. I'm leaving what we can do. Maybe we can talk about what we can do later.
Yeah, because as Ndugu Rugarama comes in, the issue becomes so complex. If you are going to say the Western countries, the Western democracies are democratic, they observe all the human rights, and you are going to deny people oxygen at the critical time when we had COVID, can this qualify to be a crime against humanity? I mean, if it were an African country, that would have been so easy, that is a crime against humanity.
Well, the UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral sanctions, there's a person who was a United Nations Special Rapporteur on unilateral sanctions, meaning sanctions which are not imposed by states. Is a rapporteur on sanctions imposed by individual countries. This person is quoted as saying this is a violation to international, UN Charter and international law. That is what the rapporteur says. But of course, you find that the proponents, like the United States, always argue that cite us the provision. Which provision is that? If you say we have violated, because they keep arguing, for example, under those laws, it gives exception, for example, that in United Nations activities, US is obligated to respect, and that is why even Iran, even Cuba, they have their embassies in New York. So their argument, even if you look at the law itself, the law has exemption clause which says it will respect United Nations provisions or systems. So if you ask them, they will tell you, okay, you're saying we are violating. Which one? Because they are saying we respect UN. Even people will consider our enemies under UN, we are obliged to let them enter our country.
Yes.
In this, they have entered, and they're in New York with their offices and residents. But other jurists, other international law experts will argue that if you touch life and it leads to loss of life,
exactly,
then that is a violation. And therefore, we resort to the provisions which guarantees right to life. If you deny food, then we resort to the interpretation by citing provisions which guarantee right to food. But according to United States, they want an expressed or an explicit provision. And this could only be argumented and the jurisprudence developed maybe if we had a court which would argument it. But now the interpretation is, we take it in an interpretative provision, because the special rapporteur will say his or her opinion, then the international jurists, other experts will say their opinion, and the United States will say their opinion. It will end there. Maybe if we could go to a forum where somebody would raise this up and would be argumented. For example, South Africa was bold enough to take Israel to court. So non-positions are argumented and declared by court. So somebody can rightly cite it and said, yes, I think it is this provision, and I went to court and court agreed with me.
Exactly.
But of course that will also raise an issue of implementation of whatever decision takes place. So the violations are there, but at this point, whichever violations is interpretative provision. But we know it affects life.
Exactly.
People die.
Now, Bwana Nduguru Garama, we come to this, and of course, we are talking of what do we do, especially now. The laws may be there, but enforcement, even if decisions are taken, like last time we did observe here, that over 31 times the UN has decided to remove, has voted to remove sanctions against Cuba. But America will sit down and say, you can go ahead and do it more 30 times, but nothing is going to happen. And there's no enforcement to that we cannot force you to say, oh, you can do that. Supposing we have over 50 countries of Africa, and of course other African countries through the Pan-African system, like we were saying Haiti, we are saying Brazil, and many other countries where there are a lot of black, Cuba, where there are black populations. This particular year, we say we are not going to the UN, we are boycotting until something is done. Can that be achieved?
Yeah, you see, there is nothing that cannot be achieved. We can only discuss time in as when and the will to ensure that what we want achieved,
yes,
is actually, you do something about it in order to achieve. Probably the biggest problem that we have had is that we want things to be achieved during our lifetime.
Unfortunately.
And that is very sad, because the mangoes which majority of us have been eating since our childhood were even not planted by our fathers, they were planted by our grandfathers. The seemingly literal independence that Africa in as mother continent Africa, because Comrade Paula was talking about the Pan-Africanism, which goes beyond the geographical boundaries of the African continent. The seeds of independence and self-reliance, the literature that we have, was actually planted by people who are not necessarily even the concept of Pan-Africanism that we have just Comrade Paula started by debating was started away from not just the African continent, but by comrades like the Marcus Garveys of this world. Now Marcus Garvey was millions, thousands of miles away from the African continent. And but late, of course, we all know the Nkwame Nkrumahs, who were the actual sons of the African soil, in the sense that they had to come back here, who associated, and then they came back to the African continent. So in other words, the point I'm making is that something can be done to these inhuman and uncalled for sanctions that have bedeviled not just people on the African continent, because we know, for instance, that Zimbabwe as a country has been under sanctions by mainly Britain, the former colonial master, and by extension, you see what happens is we may talk about sanctions, the American sanctions on a particular country, like now we are discussing American sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela. But by extension, their sanctions affect not necessarily the American government, but the people that the American government deal with and the countries that they deal with also are compared by implication to sanction the Cuban government, the Venezuelan government, to the extent that you can imagine domestic legislations of America will even tell you that the engagement, if we're engaging with Europe, if we're engaging with Asia, the particular countries over there, and even if the extent of the engagement is just up to the level of 10%, then you are compared by extension not to deal with Cuba simply because you are also dealing with us, even if the dealing with us is only to the extent of 10%. Now, this is the unfortunate part that we are having here. Therefore, the sanctions that economic embargo that, for instance, our friends and comrades in Cuba have suffered for now close to well over 60 years.
Yeah.
And equally, the sanctions that the people of Venezuela have suffered. Now we have in practically some of us have seen with our naked eyes the impact of these sanctions. You look at a country like Cuba with very hard-working people, with very highly qualified human resource, whose health system is very functional, but because of these sanctions, which, if you ask me, I choose to call a total economic embargo by America, and it doesn't matter. You see, you have been talking about the over 31 times that the United Nations has voted that these sanctions should be lifted from Cuba. I am very sure that the same kind of resounding vote would happen for Venezuela, because I can tell you without any single of doubt that apart from sheer arrogance on the part of the Americans, there is no any justification whatsoever as to why there should be any sanctions against Cuba or Venezuela, where you find that when Cuba chooses to say, okay, we are going to engage other comrades, where we can pick associated components to complete our health systems, as we also give them extra support where they are lacking.
Sure.
Then the Americans are going to say, look, because we extend to these other countries which you also want to deal with, we are not going to allow that. And they will use, it isn't even soft power. I wouldn't call it, because Americans are not good at soft power. Theirs is outright arrogance, and at the same time, they will directly want to deal with you, practically to deny you certain benefits that you would ordinarily be getting from them, like they also get from you. Although they, majority of the times, create a picture that for them, they are living in an enclave economy. There is nothing that they want from the rest of the members. Truth be told, all these registrations, and it's a pity that when you meet an ordinary man on the streets, and by saying that I mean even ourselves who claim to be educated in some of these things, they will tell you, you see, there is a lot of dictatorship in Venezuela. There is a lot of dictatorship in Cuba. Then it brings us to what is democracy? You see? So the moment you start looking at democracy through the lenses of somebody, an individual country, an individual system, and you say this is democracy, at one time you remember what used to be said of China. It's an open secret that China is a dictatorial regime. Even before the coming into power of Xi, they used to say that China was a dictatorship. But China is one country which every year allows her citizens in millions to get out of the country and they come back. China is one country that has got a highly increased number of millionaires and billionaires, and the number is increasing. Yeah. Now, I want to be in such a country with that kind of dictatorship. It's what I want. If I was to be asked that, would you want to live in a country like that? So therefore, in summing up, the truth of the matter is that we have got, we can only talk about sanctions against countries like Cuba, countries like Venezuela, simply because, and from these sanctions from specific countries like America, like Western Europe, but mainly real America, simply because America has got an ego where they feel they are masters of the world and they should get what they want to get without being told how they have to get it. And they even don't care, because you have heard that whenever a vote is taken at the UN, it is always lift the sanctions against Cuba, and they go ahead and they don't even give a damn, they don't lift them. But instead, you remember that even when, from their own perspective, the Barack administration had kind of reduced on the sanctions against Cuba, the coming in of Trump and his brother Pompeo actually enhanced. Exactly. And I will tell you, one of the reasons as to why they enhanced the sanctions was because there was a strong working relationship. Even up to now, it is still between Cuba and Venezuela. And why should you punish somebody for choosing a friend?
Yeah, because Venezuela was now selling oil or providing oil to the Cubans, and that was a problem. But also at the same time, I think Ndugu Awich talked about this domestic legislation that should affect another country. I sit in my country and decide that because the law here says that you don't eat in the streets, so that every person should change their law to fit that law. But at the same time, and we're talking about not the dynamism of the law, but the hypocrisy of some of these people. When other people sit in their countries and make rules and laws that govern them as a society, you come and say, no, that is not right, because I want this to be included in your laws. You are making laws to impose those laws on us, but you cannot even listen when we have passed a law which governs, and everyone in this community has said that's the law we want. Now, this type of behavior, is it outright vote of no confidence in the other people's systems? Is this meant to undermine? Because, for example, now in Venezuela and in Cuba, what they are trying to do, they know that the people of Venezuela and the people of Cuba, of course now, especially for Cuba, people who have grown in the sanctions have taken this to be a normal life anyway. They don't want to know. But knowing that that can be a problem, they have to impose more so that the people feel the pain of the economy. Most of these are because of course there are other types of sanctions, but they are basing a lot on the economic sanctions, because once you impose economic sanctions, you are going to devalue the currency. For example, in Venezuela now, to buy, I was getting the example which was very crude, that to buy a roll of toilet paper, you have to spend 1.6 million their money of Venezuela to buy just one roll of toilet paper. So when you press people so much economically, then people will turn against their governments. So then they will have to hate the leader so that you remove the leader. But back to that in domestic legislation that has to affect the other countries, can that be stopped?
Well, about the US laws or any other country's laws that affect domestic legislations is also a point of debate. But you mentioned something about Cubans or whatever taking it as normal. Maybe we need to bring it clear for the sake of the viewers. What is said in Cuba is that the sanctions against Cuba was introduced in 1960.
Yeah.
Therefore, 80% of the current population of Cubans are about 11 million. So if you talk of 80% of 11 million, you are talking of about 8 million. Out of the 11 million, about 8 million were born when sanctions was already there.
Imposed, yes.
So they know nothing apart from sanctions. That is what they mean by saying they now take it like normal. Because there is a country of 11 million people, but 8 million were born during sanctions. So I just wanted to illustrate that clearly.
Yeah.
Now about the laws that affects another country. Ideally, we live in a global village, and therefore a good law in a country could have effects outside. And that is why when you hear in many parliaments, there's a lot of talk of benchmarking. So ideally, if Mozambique has a good law, it's okay for Parliament of Kenya or Uganda to go and benchmark. For example, with all due respect, one good law that America had done and made it good for nearly the entire world is their anti-legislation on tobacco. America has been one of the countries which led the fight against tobacco. When I was young, if you walked on the street like Uganda House at this time, about nearly 5% of people would be smoking.
Sure.
But now you even wonder whether they're smoking anymore. Why? Because the Americans did it. For example, they started by levying big court awards against tobacco. People suing tobacco, I've got cancer from it, they award 10 billion. That affected it. Then they passed laws saying smoking is dangerous. Then they said don't smoke in the house. Then don't smoke in the car. Then they went into don't advertise. Then they said you advertise but say it is dangerous. Imagine you are selling your milk and they said right on that milk that drinking this milk is
at your own risk.
But you buy anyway. So these are part of the legislations that in a democratic society, in a global village would be good, and that's why people benchmark.
Exactly.
But the problem with this one is that it's not seen to operate on its own. It compels. I gave the example of European Union. European Union would want to protect its company. For example, Total from France. Total is a big company in France, and it brings a lot of money to France. And that is why they have the good morning in French. It's called what? there's that common saying which they put on Total, good morning.
The bonjour.
Bonjour.
Yeah. So, European Union, for example, would want to protect Total. But the American legislation would remove that protection, such that should Total want to do business with a third country, okay, even when the European Union law protect Total, because it gives income to Europe, to France, and therefore to Europe, this American law will still twist.
Exactly.
So this is now the unfairness it is. And its implementation, of course, depends on the strength of the country. It is unfair, really. But they argue that it is our law. So if European Union, you want Total to go, say, to Cuba, you go, but don't deal with us again. You know, they're not forcing you, but they're saying the effect of you going there is this. We are not ordering you not to go, but you go there.
Stand warned.
For example, how would it happen if you go to Cuba and your money is supposed to be paid? The international transfer system, transferring money from one bank to another, is done through America. We shall not transfer that money. So this is the danger. But permit me, I had intentionally left the effect
Yes.
of this, and I thought I would mention something, that what do we do? What should be done?
Exactly.
I just want to run through my thoughts. One, there's continuous engagement. There should be continuous engagement. I know there are leaders who diplomatically would still even mention Cuba or talk to America, even in their private diplomatic discourse. So that engagement will continue, including the Pope. A Pope who is a leader of the Catholic is ideally having a lot of immunity that he could even continue to engage United States that, come on, this is bad. But there's another aspect of engagement which is developing, which is inside the United States, the voters. You know, the law is made by members of parliament. You call it Senate or something. But this Senate are voted. Now, the discrepancy is that the decision to sanction is at a state level. The ordinary Americans have no problem. In fact, if you told him to go to Cuba today, he would even fly today.
Exactly.
Or even go by boat. So the engagement now is that the ordinary Americans, the voters, are now being conscientized to influence their MPs. Remember, their MPs, if he fears to lose a vote, it will also of necessity change.
Listen.
So there is now a developing engagement to involve the ordinary Americans to talk to their MPs
Leaders.
or refuse to vote them, to say, please, I am voting for you as a senator on condition that you go and do this. So it's continuously becoming an item. So this engagement is unique because it is now with the Americans.
Yeah.
But also not to forget engagements like from revolutionary leaders like President Museveni. President Museveni would at all forums, even at United Nations General Assembly, or even bilateral engagement with America, he would say his mind on this subject. And those are continuous engagement. On top of encouraging other friends. So if you have revolutionary leaders like Museveni, who are bold enough to say their mind, that is continuous engagement. The other bit is UN resolutions. It may not have the force of law or passing, but it's a continuous effort. So that at some time you said, but UN is saying this. So the engagement is continuous. Now, BRICS. BRICS is a new dimension in the economic dimension that would also have impact on this. And not only BRICS, of course, as you know, is Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and China. Now, others have joined. Not only will it take effect because it is there, but the idea is that it will develop and break that system which monopolizes money transfer. Or even not only it breaks that system of monopolizing money transfer, because that weapon is a very strong weapon. Do whatever you want, I will not pay your money.
Exactly.
So BRICS is intended to develop an alternative to money transfer.
Money transfers from the Americans.
No, between countries. Money transfer between countries. Because right now the monopoly is there. So it's supposed to develop a different money transfer system on top of developing even currency anyway. Because right now the dollar is the global currency.
The dominant currency. Mm-hmm.
So, alongside the BRICS capacity also will be science, technology. Because until you have that technology that will be able to break through this monopoly of international transfer, you will not get it. For example, I have said before that if the Germans say we don't have problems with Cuba, US has problem, our ship is going to take goods to Cuba, then the American legislation says as long as you dock there, we shall not allow the transfer of the money. Then you can't.
You can't.
But now you need that technology, which is already coming up, to freely develop another technological money transfer system which will preempt the monopoly.
Yeah, yeah.
So we live in a dynamic world. The world is not frozen and static. So somehow we are looking towards that direction. So this multiplicity of things will coalesce to form a way out of this fixed.
And of course, we normally ask these questions, and I personally ask these questions every other time we're here, and we're discussing on issues of policy and issues of protection, especially for the African populations. Where is African Union in this? Can African Union come up? And of course, last time I was suggesting that now that most of these sanctions are just sanctions anyway, sometimes they end up not helping, and we can see that US is just throwing out some of them, and the resolutions. Can Africans now also, under the African Union, sit down and come up with a mechanism that will also help us? Because I know we have lobby groups, some of them we are hiring the Europeans and Americans to do some of the lobbying with some of the democracies in this world. Can we develop a system that can help us to address some of these issues as a continent? Because as individual countries, there's nothing we can do. That one, it will take us another 100 years to come. But can we, as African Union, develop something that will help us to address some of these issues? And I normally ask Ndugu Rugarama on this. Does even African Union see this as a problem?
Certainly, it is a problem. You see, I have told you, Comrade Mtuta, and I've equally shared with our esteemed viewers, that it is wrong for anybody to underestimate the power behind the African Union. I even castigated publicly here those who call the African Union just a backing dog, and some say it is not dog at all. But the truth of the matter is that African Union sees some of these things. It has got limitations, I admitted them here. And any genuine, sincere debater will tell you that African Union has got its own challenges. Just like European Union. They do have challenges. Just not long ago, Britain, which claims to be one of the acorns of democracy, quote unquote, whatever that is to them, they ran away from the European Union. So African Union also has got some of the challenges. The Morocco, which used to be a member, ran away simply because of the disagreements between the position that African Union took on the Republic of Sahrawi as far as Morocco is concerned, with her occupationist kind of policy. So yes, what is happening globally, African Union sees, but we have got limitations in as far as not on policy, because we develop policy, we have got functioning units, different directorates, but the problem we have always had is the infiltration of the enemy The enemy has infiltrated the African Union, especially with money. Our own African Development Bank is problematic because we are not the financiers. And we usually, even when we have very good projects, recently we created as the African Union a unit called Food and Nutrition. It never used to be there. But I can assure you, as long as we do not have the money itself to run some of these projects, science, innovation, peace, security, ECOSOC, etc., as we know them, it is still a challenge. We know that America, United States of America, when we say America, even people in Ecuador, people in Haiti, people in they will say, we are also Americans. So what are you saying? United States of America, for that matter, the big boy around, has been bullying everybody, simply because they systematically made, especially after the creation of after the end of the Second World War and the creation of the so-called World Bank, which I call Washington Bank here, and then the usage of the dollar as a global currency, which, like my brother Comrade Pora was saying here, is that monopoly is being worked on by the creation of BRICS, and BRICS is steadily, progressively moving forward to ensure that the monopoly and the weaponization of a dollar is actually broken. It may not happen in the immediate, but it will happen.
Yeah, but the problem has, like you are saying, it may not happen today, but it will happen. The problem also been the response of the African countries. Up to now, there are a number of countries that have not even subscribed to, paid their subscription to the African Union.
You see, this is part of the problem that we have been discussing. We know you don't for instance think that even the European Union, that all the countries, actually Greece is a member of European Union. It is falling far below in terms of remitting her subscription to the European Union for God knows how many years. She has been bailed out over 4 times by Germany and the European Union itself, then Germany as a country, more than 4 times. But she is continuously, and yet we know historically that Greece was the epitome of knowledge, the Socrates of this world originated from Greece. So yes, African Union also has those challenges that some countries actually do not submit or pay their subscription
because
fees.
I think that we'll have a discussion on that for another
But
day.
that's another thing altogether. The truth of the matter is that is part of the problem. That is part of the problem, that we should actually be having all member countries paying their subscription. We should be having a common voice. It doesn't happen. Recently we were complaining here, you remember. We would discuss as a YACA, and part of what is contained in the treaty is that we trade as a bloc. But Kenya was discussing independently with America, and I think they struck a deal.
Yeah, they got
you
a
see,
deal.
what does that mean? You are therefore dealing a blow to the spirit of East African community. But these are some of the challenges that an organization established must combat.
Sure.
This is what we do. And
yes, and Ndugu, I wish as we close your parting shot on this.
Now, I'll talk 2 things. I'll comment on what African Union can do and also make my closing remark. Now, African Union was before OAU, Organization of African Union. Now, during OAU, we had committees like Liberation Committee. I don't know whether in the transition it was picked up. Now, not sure about the presence of Sanctions Committee, if there is any.
I don't think we have.
So, those would have been functional committees. The Liberation Committee did its work. in the liberation of South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, you know, it did its work. Although there is still the issue of Sahrawi. So I don't know whether the Liberation Committee is abandoned, and yet some people still, in fact not some people, African Union still recognizes that Sahrawi people are in a struggle. They are a member of African Union, but they are not free. Now, so if you were to talk in terms of sanctions, this could be areas to consider. But the biggest challenge there is the principle of sovereignty. Each of the 54 African countries still believe or even know they are sovereign. So, taking a unified position is challenging because, for example, if America sanctions Libya, the American would say we are sanctioning Libya. So other countries will want to take an independent stand because they are sovereign. I mean, we will not go into detail, but also assuming there was a decision taken that we defend ourselves against sanction or impose, the enforceability is completely difficult. Just like if a UN also faces issues of enforceability.
Yes. Yeah,
UN
sure.
doesn't have its own police, it doesn't have its own prison, whatever it is. So enforceability amidst sovereignty is very difficult. So these are the challenges that African Union would face. Even if you take a position to defend yourself against sanctions, or, for example, if you are told that a Venezuelan plane which lands in your country don't put fuel, and you decide, you know, it's terrible on its enforceability. You can easily enforce the sanction from outside than enforce yours.
Yes.
So I leave it at this. But now my closing remark about sanction is that powers that are strong enough should try to be very judicious in exercising their legislations that affect other countries. Because practice has shown that as they pass their legislations which affect other countries, it has affected lots of violation of human rights. So it is my wish that these countries exercise their right to pass their domestic laws judiciously. But I also want to call upon the African revolutionaries, or even revolutionaries around the world, to stand firm in decisions that they make. I know for a fact that President Museveni is one of them, to stand firm on these issues, and it is even willing to even trade with other countries just in case some other countries prove difficult. So sanctions, the effect has proved negative. Sanctions has not proved positive. For example, the idea that Cubans would overthrow their country to fail.
Exactly.
For many years now, they thought they put sanction on Cuba, they rise up, they refuse to rise up. Instead, people are suffering.
Yeah, exactly. At the end of it is the people who are suffering. You may
Just
not.
one
Okay, as we conclude.
Just three things really. One, I want to state categorically that because United States of America has realized that the rest of the world is willing and is alive to the fact that the Cubans and the Cuban leadership is innocent, and that consistently the United Nations has been voting in favor of lifting the economic sanctions, they have now listed Cuba as a terrorist country. That is wrong, and I publicly call upon the leadership in the United States of America to do away with that kind of legislation. It is wrong, it is not correct, and they know they are lying.
Yeah, sure.
The unfair and unrealistic sanctions against Venezuela must, as of yesterday, be lifted, because a country has got a right to choose her friends and deal with them accordingly. And there is nothing against Venezuela apart from the fact that Venezuela, just like Cuba, chooses her friends, and they would want to do business on their own terms without the exogenous interference. 3, I am at pains to explain to our colleagues on the African continent that some of these so-called sanctions on our countries like Zimbabwe is not because of our democratic credentials, but it is simply because of the need by these imperialistic forces to tap into our natural resources and take them almost free of charge. And we must, as a matter of urgency, as far as fighting against imperialism is concerned, to wave away these so-called sanctions, come together, and if it needs carrying out a revolution, a physical one, like we did to liberate ourselves from colonialism, do it and get away from these so-called sanctions.
Yes, and which was wondering whether we still have the Liberation Committee at the African Union. Thank you so much, viewer. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time of this discussion, and we appreciate, I'm sure, when viewers out there take this time also with a lot of gratitude. We are finally coming to the end of this program today, but we shall be back next week on Friday with more discussion. I think this will be a new thing because we have definitely had a lot of discussion about this, these sanctions, and I have information that we shall be sharing for those people who managed to send that to us. We will be starting with that next week before we go for the next discussion. But we thank you for the time being with us, and we wish you the best of the weekend, and we thank the team that has been behind the production of this program. Until next week is when we shall meet again. Have a nice weekend and be blessed. Thank you.
Of the day on UBC.
One-on-one with